Across the nation, Americans struggled in the pursuit of racial justice. Despite the Constitution's promise of equality through the 14th Amendment, discrimination lingered, fortifying segregation and allowing the legacy of slavery to haunt America. In the landmark case of Plessy v. Ferguson, the Supreme Court endorsed Jim Crow laws, arguing public facilities should be separate but equal, which allowed the mindset of white supremacy to continue. Segregation had a stranglehold on the country, North and South. After nearly a century of bigotry and lack of government support after Reconstruction, attention was given to legalize segregation, with Brown v. Boards of Education's ruling that segregation in the educational system was unconstitutional. While the legacy of Plessy v. Ferguson was dead, another problem came forth: de facto segregation. In Illinois, some schools justified segregation through residential boundaries that separated races. To respond to this injustice in 1963, the Illinois State Legislature amended its school code to include a provision known as the Armstrong Act. The Armstrong Act was an attempt to eliminate racial segregation by ordering violating school districts to modify their boundaries. This type of action to assure racial balance was unprecedented in state or national legislature. However, the legislation failed to alter the status quo within certain communities. Waukegan, Illinois became the first city to test the Armstrong Act in court. In Waukegan, suspected Ku Klux Klan intimidation from the 1920s was reflected well into the 1960s. Realtors became culprits, restricting the black population and their freedom to live where they wanted. While the KKK led to the creation of social boundaries, an obvious difference in pay between whites and minorities led to the creation of economic boundaries, which also limited where blacks settled in Waukegan. This prevented blacks from purchasing the more expensive homes in the north side of Waukegan. Blacks stumbled as they attempted to climb the social ladder, destroying their hopes of achieving the American dream. In a few cases, when a home in a predominantly white neighborhood was sold to a minority, the whites would move out immediately.
Our organization was responsible for fair housing because we protested the fact that blacks could only live in certain parts of Waukegan. And Waukegan became the first city in Lake County to have a fair housing.
By 1966, blacks had grown impatient with the ineffectiveness of protests and were eventually tired of asking white people to show some respect. This led to throwing bricks, firebombs, and police brutality, instead of turning the other cheek. These actions attempted to break the social and economic walls, publicizing the frustration of the black community. The disturbances were commonly known as race riots. However, for some, they were merely reactions to the injustice. In the midst of this racial upheaval in Waukegan, a small group of parents also saw the injustice, particularly in education, and decided to take matters into their own hands. They were led by Shirley Tometz, a mother of three. Her sons James Tometz attended Whittier Elementary School during this tumultuous time, which fueled her determination. When drawing boundaries for elementary schools, the school district made Whittier primarily black, while its surrounding schools were all white. Marilyn Moiseo was an involved parent who partnered with Tometz to provide an equal education for children of all races.
Probably my greatest happiness comes from the fact that my children, both Greg and Kirsten, were able to go to school from grade school through high school with children from all races and ethnicities and economic backgrounds. So they grew up understanding that there were different values, different mindsets, and they became friends with so many different diverse children.
Accompanying Shirley Tometz on this crusade against injustice, Edith Smith was a mother concerned with the quality of her children's education. She was a teacher and advocate for equality who noticed Waukegan's black children, like others across the country, were at a disadvantage in terms of education and idea of self-worth.
Kenneth Clark went to the South and he interviewed 20 school kids, all African-American school kids, and he showed them two dolls, a white doll and a black doll, and they were similar in all ways. He said to the kids, "Tell me which doll is the nice doll." And a lot of the kids, even though they were black children, they picked the white doll. They felt inferior just because they had grown up always feeling like they were second class, that they were segregated.
Many of Waukegan's black teachers recognized black children were predisposed to feel inferior, which in turn hindered their success. With the help of the NAACP, they worked to make their goal of equal education a reality. The use of petitions and board meetings were not enough, so black and white parents united. As mothers of Whittier students, Edith Smith and Shirley Talmadge joined forces. They continued their endeavors with hopes that all children may one day have the chance to interact with other races. The process of desegregating Whittier divided a once cohesive black community. Some people hid in fear of upsetting the system, but Edith Smith followed her intuition, believing, "You have to fight for what is right. You cannot just accept what people decide to give you." While some blacks adhered to Smith's principle, others preferred the comfort and familiarity of being amongst their own race. Despite the tensions between races that prevented some blacks from taking action, others, including the Talmadge, Smith, and Moiseo's families, came together for a greater good.
That part of it was, in those days, I had lots of cooperation from the black people, but it was difficult for them because if they even showed any kind of notice of helping out on something like this, they'd lose their jobs, anything. Everybody was scared.
Escalating the fear within the black community was Waukegan's outspoken mayor, Robert Sabanjian. Waukegan residents were aware of Mayor Sabanjian's controversial opinions towards the black community. He did not believe Waukegan's black population were entitled to the same rights as white.
We have to handle these characters like daffodils instead of the bums that they are, where we could throw them in a jail where they belong. No, we have to tap them on the wrist. Now, the other problem, which caused this situation, is the NAACP. Their continual announcements of planned demonstrations, their continual announcements of mass meetings, has worked these people up in a frenzy, these irresponsible hoodlums, who the so-called civil rights workers are working in their behalf for first-class citizenship. Well, I think that NAACP should turn right around and start doing something about demonstrating against these undesirables in their own race.
The publicity of Sabanjian's confrontation with the NAACP forced people to decide whether or not to remain a bystander, or to take action either violently or peacefully. Turning away from the violent actions of some, the persistent Whittier parents felt that the most effective step to settle de facto segregation was through peaceful means, which led to challenging the discriminatory system.
But my mother stood up and said, well, if you need a person, I feel strongly enough, and we'll put the lawsuit in my son's name, James Talmadge versus the Board of Education.
The Board of Education denied Talmadge's initial plans to change the residential boundaries, so she gathered a petition from parents to convey a need for change. The school board remained indifferent, believing education was already accommodating. At this time, school board members were appointed by the mayor, which gave Sabanjian the upper hand. He carefully chose people to be members of the Board of Education in order to run a system that modeled his racist views. The school board insisted that they randomly divided the schools. Their main concern was the student safety, considering traffic hazards and walking distances, and the available finances did not allow them to fund such drastic changes. The Whittier parents continued their battle. After a prolonged appeals process, a major turning point developed when the Illinois Supreme Court heard the case.
You can throw the pebble in to the middle of the pond, but those ripples are going to come back over here. And when they come back, they're coming back to you.
The ripples extended throughout the community, reaching the hearts of many. The dim light of hope was finally illuminated when the court ordered the Board of Education to take accountability for their negligence. The Illinois State Supreme Court sustained that the Armstrong Act was constitutional. This served as the initial push for schools to redraw their boundary lines. Eventually, this resulted in schools that deliberately maintain a racial balance through open enrollment. For the first time in Waukegan, an equal education for children of all races was possible. Although people had a tendency to sway toward violence, Waukegan proved that fruitless violence only increased tension between races. Waukegan's victory through peaceful protest was a turning point, which welcomed understanding between races. Breaking these boundaries was not easy, and Waukegan has yet to reach its full potential, but the unwavering, committed work of Shirley Talmadge, Edith Smith, Frank Harris, Marilyn and Dennis Moiseo helped transform a city once characterized by its racism and division into a land that embodies acceptance and diversity.
I think there's kind of a lesson for everybody that if you feel strongly about something, you should stand up and do something about it. Because unfortunately in society, people may feel that they want something to happen, they're just not willing to stand up for it. A lot of people are that way. So, it takes a strong person to say, I not only feel strongly about this, but I'm going to do something about it.